Hi everyone, I'm Tim Finn. I own a brick and mortar comic shop in. Oh, you got that song.
Well, that's right. Then he's watching.
Okay. I own a brick and mortar comic book shop in Massachusetts, Hub Comics. I also blog at A Real American Book. To my left is the host and mastermind of Talking Joe, Mark Seddon.
Hey.
You want to tell him about the podcast and the URL? And then we'll start.
Yep. So you can find us at talkingjoe.co.uk. That's the website that points you at all the places we can be found. We're on YouTube, on all of your favorite podcast platforms. We release an episode once a week talking about all things G.I. Joe and talking to all sorts of interesting comic creators such as Larry, current creators and also creators from the past like Jim Shooter, Rod Wiggum, all of the greats.
Ladies and gentlemen, Larry Hama.
Greetings all.
Can we have maybe a show of hands? How many people have seen Larry before at a con? Seen it? Okay. And how many people this is the first time? Okay, a little bit of a mix.
We're going to try and ask Larry some of the less commonly asked questions. So I think we'll skip over the how did you get the G.I. Joe job and how do you write G.I. Joe. We love those answers, but if you want to hear Larry tell us, go back 2 years in the Talking Joe history and watch or listen to our regular podcast episode interview with Larry. Okay, Larry.
Mm-hmm.
Recently in G.I. Joe, we had a self-contained issue, a story that was done in 1 in 20 pages, issue 314, drawn by Andrew Cronky, and it came after a bunch of an extended storyline.
Mm-hmm.
Can we expect some self-contained issues coming up? Do you want to write more self-contained issues?
Absolutely. Well, we have one self-contained issue coming up that's a silent issue, not done by me.
Okay,
But
just the plot.
I plotted it, and wrote it out, and it's being drawn by somebody else.
Okay.
Pardon me, but I can never remember people's names because.
I know who it is. Should I tell them?
Yeah,
or is
sure.
this a secret?
No, tell them.
Oh, this issue, the silent issue is being drawn by Chris Mooneyham, who has been doing half of the issues so far at Skyhound.
And I really love his work. The stuff is really dynamic and and jumps. It doesn't just sit there. But yeah, I'm doing more sort of extended arcs. So I like to break up the arcs with something that's more of an entree, a single contained issue that still introduces characters and is capable of being read as a stand. You don't have to know all this history. I was always aware of that right from the beginning. That when I started out writing G.I. Joe in 1982, the usual, all the other comics at Marvel, like X-Men and whatever, had really convoluted backstories, and if you weren't plugged into the last 5 years of any of these continuities, you had no idea what was going on. And so my mission was I wanted to make every other or every third issue of G.I. Joe an entree issue, and also extend that through the whole line so that there were various subplots going on. So even if a subplot ended, a new subplot was beginning, and somebody could jump in on that. That was the thing that I felt was very restrictive about how superhero comics and other comics were done, is that they started doing these long arcs that made it very difficult for a new reader to enter the stream. When I was a kid, almost every comic was a standalone. You didn't have to know 25 years of Batman history just to read a Batman comic, or Superman or anything else. And even the Marvel comics, you didn't have to know an awful lot about Spider-Man to be able to jump in.
And in the recent years, you've been doing this extended story, focusing in on the Cobra Casino and then the Genghis Khan character, and sort of continuing almost up to present day, sort of a quite tight, single, extended, epic story. Was that sort of an intended approach, that you wanted to have a particularly long story for this recent period?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
You rephrase it, Jim.
The story that starts around a year before the end of IDW, the Cobra Casino, and Serpentor Khan, it feels like more of one plot with less subplots. And we've taken this as a big extended story that's lasted now 20 issues. When you started that, or partway through, how did that feel, and what was your intent?
Well, it's very difficult for me to nail down intentions, because I don't, first of all, I've never written an outline in my life. I don't know what happens in the next issue. I don't know what happens on page 5 until I get to page 4. I literally write all this stuff page by page. What I used to do is I would try to get the Joes into a really impossible situation on page 1, and then figure out how to get them out of it by page 22. And by not knowing what was coming next, I solved the problem that I always had with everything that I was reading or watching on TV or whatever, is that, sometimes you get into the third page, or you get, 15 minutes in, and you realize, oh, I know how this ends, And it's very difficult as a writer to not telegraph, what the ending is. But I figured that if I didn't know the ending myself, I couldn't telegraph it. And it led for more suspense. And I was building that all into the story structure by having the page break at the end of every page, instead of having one panel bleeding over to the next page. That way I could build in a little bit of suspense at the end of every page. My idea was to make everybody have to turn that page, and then at the end, not understanding why the compulsion was, oh wow, it was a real page turner. But it was all designed in.
Is there a risk, if you don't know the end, that you write yourself into a corner? So I think of this because Simon Furman, who has written a lot of Transformers comics, at a convention once said he knows the ending because he doesn't want to get to the last page and not know how to get out of it. So is there a risk, if you don't know the end until you get there, that you get to the end and you don't have a good idea?
Well, that's why starting at page 1 on every single story is like jumping into the deep end of the pool. But if you don't have that, you get complacent. I mean, and I've had, I got to the end of one story once, and I had all the Cobras sinking into a quicksand. And when that story came out, and it came out in a Marvel bundle to all the other Marvel people, Chris Claremont came storming into my office, and he said, wait a minute, you had all the bad guys sinking into quicksand in the last panel of the story. How are you going to get them out of that? And I said, I don't know. and if you go back and look at it in the next issue, they're all out of the quicksand. And nobody commented on it. And that's when I realized,
You've got some leeway.
yeah, there's some things that people care about, and some people, that if you're invested in a fantasy, you're willing to accept, a lot of, wonky stuff because, you've got so much invested in the core fantasy. And to me, the important thing was the characters. I tried to concentrate on the characters and make the characters as lifelike and accessible as possible. To me, the plot is just, whatever you can hang these characters on. When I was an editor at Marvel, I would ask I would say to all my writers, so tell me, have you ever read Peanuts? And they all go, yeah, well, I've been reading Peanuts since I was a kid, And I say, well, okay, tell me what happens in any one given Sunday Peanut strip. Tell me the plot. And they all go, well, Lucy is holding the football. And Charlie Brown comes running up, and at the last minute, she pulls the football away, and Charlie Brown goes flat on his back. And I said, well, that's just a setup. He used it dozens of times. What was, tell me the actual plot, and no one can do it, And I would say to them, well, have you seen any of the Harry Potter movies? And they say, yeah. I'd say, well, tell me the plot of any one Harry Potter movie. And nobody could really do that. And it's because I said, you don't go to see the next Harry Potter movie because you said, man, the plot of that last one was bitching, You go back because you're invested in those characters. You like those characters, and you want to spend more time with the characters. And the more you can make the characters be accessible and realistic, the stronger that compulsion is. So my main concern is always about nailing the characters and keeping the characters consistent. That's why most of the Joes are based on people I actually know or knew. Stalker is based on my friend Ed Davis, who did 2 tours in Nam as a LERP, lost an eye. I also used him as the basis of Wraith in the Wolverine comics. And in fact, when they made the movie with Wraith in it, they made him look exactly like Ed Davis. They gave him the hat, the cowboy hat, the suit, and the Tony Lama boots and everything. And that was actually the way Ed Davis dressed. And he was a fantastic artist. When he got out of the Army, he had been court-martialed in Saigon for murder. He got acquitted, okay? And during his trial, somebody gave him a blank sketchbook and he started drawing. It was the first time he ever drew. And he started drawing in the sketchbook. And that was all he had when he got out of the Army. He went to Marvel and he showed that sketchbook to Virginia Ramita, and she looked at it and she said, well, it doesn't really look like Johnny's stuff, But she said, well, there's this guy 3 blocks downtown. He's got a studio named Neil Adams, and this is maybe more up your alley. So he came over to Neil's studio with this one sketchbook, and he was wearing a Savile Row suit, a white shirt, no tie, a Stetson cowboy hat, and Tony Lama boots, okay? And he had been the president of one of the largest black gangs in Brooklyn before he went into service. So he was a genuine badass. And he showed, so Neil is sitting there holding court, and he shows the book to Neil, and Neil looks at her. Doesn't say anything. And sitting in the corner is Howie Chaykin, who had just had his first Wofford and Gray Mauser book come out. And he was like gloating and had his feet up on the desk, and feeling very full of himself. And Neil walks over and puts that sketchbook in front of Howard Chaykin and says, "Take a look at this." And Howard looked at it, and the first page was like the Blackhawks, like they really should have looked all the time. He had Batman. He had all these super characters done like amazingly. And then he had like candid shots from Vietnam. He had like a drawing of a bunch of GIs hosing down a personnel carrier, an M113, and everything was perfect. He had a shot of this old Mama San sitting on a straw mat, squatting on a straw mat, and on her mat she had like a copy of Penthouse and 2 packs of Salem cigarettes and a bottle of Coke. That was her merchandise, and it was all beautifully, perfectly. This guy had never drawn before in his life. It's totally natural. He could look at something once and draw it photographically. Okay, and Howie goes, "Who the hell did this?" He jumps up, and eventually they became really good friends, and they started a studio together. But that's how it was. I don't know how I got off on that track.
It's a cool track.
Okay. But Ed, he did some work for Marvel. He did some work for heavy metal, and did a lot of advertising stuff with Howard. And then one day he asked to borrow $3,000 off of me so he could go to Central America and be a merc. So that was the last I saw of him.
Talking of natural talents, maybe, should we?
Abruptly shifting gears.
Yeah.
I've got a good.
I've heard this story before, and I'm very pleased to hear it again, and that more people can hear it. Mark, want to ask a G.I. Joe?
I was going to segue into talking about natural talents like Ed. Maybe you can tell us about the first time you met Michael Golden and the path to drawing that amazing yearbook that he did.
Well, Michael Golden, first of all, I was an editor at DC. This is in the late 70s. And Vinnie Coletta was the art director at DC. And one day he comes into my office and he closes the door and he locks it. And he sits down across from me and he says, "Kid, I got to ask you a favor." And I was thinking, I'd rather have Vinny owe me a favor than me owe Vinny a favor. Because Vinny was like, one of those guys. And in fact, he got indicted by the New Jersey State Anti-Crime Commission. And they accused Vinnie Coletta of being the head of all organized crime loan sharking activity in the whole state of New Jersey, which would have made him Tony Soprano's boss.
You all know Vinnie Coletta for his inking over her Trimby on the G.I. Joe and Transformers crossover.
Yeah, and he had, and he was a real character, and so he says to me, I said, "Okay, what's the favor?" He says, "Well, there's this kid that goes to my wife's church." That's the last thing an editor wants to hear. I'm thinking, oh my God, how bad is this kid going to be, And I also knew that his wife was a Jehovah's Witness, And I said, well, what's that like? Your wife and your daughter are both Jehovah's Witnesses, And he said, "Oh, it's great. I come home every day and everybody's really happy." He says, "They're happy that they're going to heaven and I'm not." So I said, "Okay, tell the kid to come in on a Monday." And so next Monday, this clean-cut guy in a suit and a tie you know, with a really fresh haircut, walks in, he's got a portfolio. I think, oh God, you know, and he lays this stuff out. Holy smoke, you know, this guy was born with it, you know. And I didn't want to let him out of my office until I could give him a job. And I went next door to Al Milgram's office. I said, look, you got to give this guy a job. We can't let him walk out of the office. So Al Milgram gave him a bat mite job. And while he was doing that, I was able to convince Russ Heath to ink him on Mr. Miracle. So he did 2 issues of Mr. Miracle for me. And then what happened was that DC didn't want to give him a raise, you know. So he went up, and Marvel said, hey, come over here, you know, we'll pay you good money. And he went right over to Marvel. And that's what he was doing. I think he did Star Wars for a while, and then he did Micronauts at Marvel. But he was one of these guys that he could start drawing in ink at the upper left-hand corner and finish at the lower right-hand corner. And it was like a scanner was putting it all in. It was like he had a Kundalini eye in the middle of his forehead, and he could like project what was in his head down on the paper and just trace it. And it was amazingly accurate. If you've ever seen one of his Ghost Rider covers, it's a Ghost Rider cover where Ghost Rider's on his bike over Manhattan, and it's drawn with a fisheye lens. So all the perspective, you know, goes like this.
This is the 2-issue crossover with Doctor Strange.
Yeah.
In 1991.
And it was like, and it was night shot. So it was all like, you know.
Underlit.
Yeah. And
from the city.
And there was no way he could have faked that, but he did, you know, and it was totally accurate. He was an amazing artist, but the original reaction to him on G.I. Joe was, no, we don't like him because he's too cartoony.
You say reaction. You don't mean the other editors. You mean the kids.
Yeah, the readers, they all wrote in and said, we don't like this Michael Golden guy. He's too cartoony. And that was because, you know, a 10-year-old boy, you know, doesn't want to them, anything that looks cartoony is kiddie stuff. And they would, you know, they reject it. So we want more realistic stuff like Ron Wiggum, you know. And they didn't seem to understand that, like, to every artist in the business, Michael Golden and Alex Toth were like gods, you know. And most of the reading public couldn't give 2 shits about them. So what can you say?
Can you tell us a little bit about the experience of Michael putting that issue together specifically?
Yearbook 2.
Oh, the yearbook? Well, the thing is, I wrote it with him in mind because I knew that he could do all this equipment. You know, everything, all that Soviet Warsaw Pact equipment in that book is totally accurate. All the weapons, the Hind helicopter, the mosquito bomber. So I started throwing in everything that I could think of that I thought that was really cool that I wanted to see Michael Golden draw. So, and I knew that if I gave him stuff that he liked to draw, you know, that was the thing. It's like I would always ask any new artist on the book, what do you like to draw? And then I would make sure that there was a ton of it in every story. You know, I knew Herb Trimpe loved airplanes, so I put airplanes in every story that Trimpe drew. And, you know, if you keep the artist happy like that, they give you really good work.
Here's a segue. So you just talked about equipment and an artist drawing a lot of accurate equipment. Something that makes G.I. Joe so particular is that there's all this gear, not just vehicles, but weapons and, you know, night vision goggles, and you are really specific about it. Your characters will sometimes tell each other what they have. This happened even 2 months ago in I think issue 315.
With the ghillie suits and the...
And the new issue from 2 weeks ago. And other comics don't read like this, right? In a Punisher comic, he doesn't rattle off all of the specific gear he's using. What is your interest in all of this gear? Because it's such a particular thing in G.I. Joe, and it feels like a really good fit for you.
Well, I'm a gearhead, I like guns, and swords, and tanks, and, all that stuff. I fly flight sims. I fly DCS flight sims. They're the most accurate and the most complicated. I mean, lots of commercial flight sims, they're like arcade games. You just, shoot down stuff or, fire missiles at stuff all the time. But in the DCS sims, some of the aircraft require 20 minutes to just start. You got to turn on, the electrical this and the electrical that, and you got to turn on this and turn on that, and turn on the fuel gauges and and it literally takes 20 minutes just to get from the hangar out to the tarmac, and I love that. And I just like I'm not interested in the dogfight stuff. I like to just get it up in the air and go to the navigation console and plot in all my waypoints and do all the navigation and navigate from one place to another and then fly back to the base and land. So that's why I was already plugged into that. That's why
I was going to say.
a lot of people come to me and they say their most favorite issue of G.I. Joe is the dogfight issue. And, because that was one I really liked to do. So I had a lot invested in it. So that's the thing, you have to find, if you're not projecting what you like and what interests you and play it to the hilt, then you're just, you're just treading water, and a lot of comics are just choreography, and to a certain extent, that works. I mean, you don't go to see a kung fu movie because you're going to be intrigued by the plot. There's no plot, but you want to see this fantastic choreography, right? And all movies changed abruptly after The Matrix, because up until The Matrix, all fights in movies were not cause and effect. They were just choreography, People throw a punch, and you cut the guy getting hit, So you could get people who couldn't fight at all, and by using these tight cuts and close-ups, make it look like they were competent fighters. You can't do that in a kung fu movie. In a kung fu movie, the audience wanted to see the whole figure and an uninterrupted cut. They didn't want to cut away from the action. That's what they did in The Matrix. Go back and look at it. It's put together like a kung fu movie, but on top of the kung fu movie choreography, they had a real plot and likable characters. And after that, you couldn't do the old style fights in movies anymore. If you go back and actually look at these things, you realize that, I think the last big movie that had the old style fights in was Batman Returns, or something like that. And nobody liked it. But, a lot of the culture and media changes that way. And there's these big sea changes, and most people don't even notice it.
We were talking about character and the importance of character earlier. I noticed that recently there's been a big focus on Cobras. It's a battle between Cobra Commander, Destro, the Blue Ninja faction with Alpha 001, and then the Genghis Khan version of Serpentor, with G.I. Joe to a certain degree taking a little bit of a back seat. Are the Cobras just more fun to write?
In a way, yeah, because, there's more drama and intrigue within, I mean, the whole thing of the actual Joes is that the basis of the fantasy is about camaraderie and loyalty. It's not about shooting things. It's about the fantasy that, things will work out and justice prevails, and that people will stand up for you, and no matter what happens in whatever situation you're in, Snake Eyes will come and get you out of it, And, kids have told, people have told me when they read it as a kid that the entire fantasy of there being actual justice, is really strong for a kid because, by the time you're in kindergarten, you faced a lot of injustice, a lot of, bullying and whatever, and it's very difficult as a kid to see, to actually believe in that sort of the fairness doctrine because you don't see it in real life, and a lot of kids say, they like G.I. Joe because they had a terrible family life, that they had an abusive father or something, and that family situation was so horrible that they needed an escape, and like G.I. Joe was this fantasy realm that they could go into where the Joes stood up for each other, and they were faithful and loyal to each other, and so that's the different fantasy. That's a different fantasy from the Cobra fantasy, and the Cobras are more divided. So you always have this rivalry between Cobra Commander and Destro and even Zartan, and they all have a demarcation of values and ideals. You understand that Destro really has a sense of honor, and so does Zartan to a degree. Whereas Cobra Commander is just, he's Cobra Commander. So that provides more like frisson, more friction and energy within the plot line. So that's where you get the action out of.
For Cobra Commander, we were asked this question the other day, and it sort of stumped us to a little bit. What is Cobra Commander's motivation? What is he actually trying to achieve? Is there a way that he could ever win? What would winning look like to him?
Well, he started out as being like, an Amway guy. He was just running a pyramid scheme. And somebody yesterday asked me, I had once said that I had based Cobra Commander's speech pattern on William F. Buckley, because he always struck me as being this real pretentious guy who liked to use a lot of big words. Yeah, that's a good gimmick for Cobra Commander. So I combined that with the fact that when I write Cobra Commander dialogue, I'm hearing Orson Welles in my head. This deep, stentorian, the opposite of the animated show. To me, Cobra Commander says,
Retreat!
You ignorant ignoramus. Not like, when I write Destro, I hear Sean Connery in my head. So I have real points of reference to try to keep all these characters consistent.
If Cobra Commander started as this pyramid scheme guy, now that he has this global army, what would winning look like for him?
Well, no, he doesn't know, because it's like the thing with oligarchs and plutocrats. They just want to have it all. And I think,
and then that wouldn't be enough.
no, and it wouldn't be enough.
Or he'd be unhappy.
Yeah. And that's a major problem with the world right now. It used to be that, most people were just happy with just getting by. But TV and all else, it's like, it's made, let's face it, 100 years ago, if you were a working class guy, you couldn't even conceive of what it was like to be an Astor or a Carnegie or any of these billionaires. But now everyone could watch these tours of these people's houses, and you're exposed to what their lifestyle is like, and all of a sudden everybody wants that. They want the bling, they want this, and that's a big change from even 100 years ago. Or a big change from for me even, I remember when I got my first monthly book at Marvel, I was making $23 a page, and I could barely do a page a day, but I thought I was doing good, and I remember having a conversation with another artist, and we both, this is like 1973, I said, man, if we could only make 10 grand a year, we'd be like living high off the hog. But that's what it was like, and all of that has changed.
A couple years back in the monthly G.I. Joe, you introduced for a scene or two Spirit Iron Knife's parents.
Huh?
You checked in with Sneak Peek's mom, and it turns out that Duke is married. And I really like the family stuff. What is the balance? And those three things felt new. What is the balance for this comic where we see them at work, right? The base and the mission is them at work. So what is the balance between the gear and the mission and getting there and family stuff, or this sort of other side?
I wanted to flesh out the characters more and show the human side. And, I think I may have gone too far on one issue I did for Devil's Due, where there was like the origin stories of a lot of these Joes. And there was one character had to go, he decided he had to, somebody in his training unit got killed during training, and he decided on his own to go visit the guy's parents, and his mother was like, living in a trailer someplace, and trying to capture that sort of moment, where that's very, it really registers with ex-soldiers, and to go and talk to this person, and she's like, nobody else ever came and said anything, and he said, yeah, but, and she said, well, were you really close? And he said, well, no, not really, but he was in my unit, so it's like a brother, I tried to get stuff like that into it, so that there's an emotional base to the characters, and you understand, their roots and origins. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry?
Okay. To me, the most interesting types of characters to do is like explain a character that was sort of like ignored. in the first issue of G.I. Joe, on the control panel on the splash page, you list all the Joes, and at the far end there's one that says shooter, where the face is obscured. Well, that wasn't in my script. Rick Parker, the letterer, just decided to get brownie points with the editor-in-chief by putting his name on the splash page. And everybody for years kept asking me, well, why isn't Shooter in? So years later, I came up with the idea that on the actual first mission, there was a sniper that was unknown to the Joes, that was, along with the mission, incognito, and that was Shooter, And I based her character and her everything on a girl I had gone to high school with me, Jody Craig, who I'm still in contact with. And she has 5 sons, all of whom are in the military. They're all career military. So, when they actually made an action figure of Shooter, and they listed her code name her file name is Jody Craig. I got Hasbro to send her a big box of them, and she was really verklempt. and all of her sons got copies, and it was great. Yeah.
Larry, I would love to read a news story set in the first year with the original 13 characters.
That's possible.
Would you be interested in writing such a story? It could be a single issue. It could be many issues.
I think it would make a great one-shot. It's good to plan those in.
Just points at me. No, it's all right. It's all right. So you've been writing G.I. Joe since probably 1981, if the issue came out, 82. All this time. I'll start. Can you envision a time that you're not writing G.I. Joe?
Excuse me?
Can you envision a time that you are not writing G.I. Joe?
Well, it's happened, I mean, I was always the last person they asked. I was the last person they asked to write the original book. At Devil's Due, they didn't even let me write the main book,
Can I rephrase the question?
Yeah.
Now that you have been writing G.I. Joe continuously again for longer than the Marvel run, right? Because the IDW run plus the current Skybound run is longer than 82 to 94.
Right.
And every month, your editor, whoever it's been, you turn in a plot. Right now, can you imagine a time that you're not writing G.I. Joe?
Well, sure.
Well, that was simple.
I've got a life. First of all, you have to understand that I got into the comics business because I was a Carl Barks fan and I wanted to do ducks. I'm a duck man.
Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck.
Yeah, I'm a big Uncle Scrooge fan. I still have Uncle Scrooge comics I bought when I was 7 years old. They're really tattered, but I have all of them. But when I got into the comic business, nobody was buying funny animals. It was all superheroes. So that's what I had to do. The last comic I ever wanted to do was a military comic, but that was the only thing on the table. So I took that. Literally, if they had offered me Barbie, I would have taken Barbie and I would have given it my best shot. So I said, well, I got this military book to do. I'm going to give it my best shot. And also, I felt compelled that I didn't want there to be a military book aimed at kids that was written by some, armchair general. I didn't want to lie to the kids. I never promised anybody a parade. You know, in the last issue of G.I. Joe, I made it all very clear, you know, that, look, you're not going to get a parade. You know, most of America is not going to even care that you did this. But, you know, you will never in your life have friends and comrades like you had in the service. Or, you know, because let's face it, one of the things that they drum into you in the military is that you are responsible, personally responsible for everybody who reports to you. You know, no matter what your rank is. If you're an E5 and you've got, you know, E1s and through E4s reporting to you, you're responsible for them. You know, you don't eat until they eat. You don't sleep until they sleep. This is not something they teach in business courses at Harvard and Yale. You know? The other thing they drummed into us constantly was, don't be a hero. Back then, a hero was a bad word. You know, they would tell you, you know, heroes get their buddies killed. You know, what makes all this work is that you're part of a team. And the highest compliment a soldier can give to another soldier is to say to him, you did your job. That's what's expected of you, and you did it. And the recipient of that knows that, you know, and that's things that I didn't see being put down in any of the other military comics, you know. And, you know, the concept of, you know, the whole concept of heroism is so strange, you know, that it's like, and people don't understand that nobody throws themselves on a grenade for God and country. You don't do that for, you know, flag and patriotism. You do that for the 5 guys, you know, in your squad. You know, you do that because, you know, they're your family, you know, and it's personal. So, you know, so that's why there's no flag waving in G.I. Joe, you know, but there's a reinforcement of the whole concept of camaraderie and loyalty. And I think that was really important. I tried to stress that in the final issue of the Marvel run, 155, but the letter from Snake Eyes. And a lot of that was based on some of my experiences, you know, so, you know, I actually had somebody spit on me at an airport, you know, called me a baby killer, you know, and that was, you know, I was going home, you know, on leave, and it was at LaGuardia Airport, and there were these, they used to have these porters, they were like sky caps, they called them, and one of them came over to me and said, you can't go home to your mom looking like that. And he took me into their dressing room area, and they took my khaki shirt and cleaned it up and ironed it and sent me on my way. And I never forgot that.
If the concept of heroism was strange then for you, does the subtitle "A Real American Hero" have you ever bristled at that? Is that too strong a word?
Yeah, I felt, you know, I just bit my tongue on that and just let it slide. Lots of times they would like throw flags on the covers, and, you know, To me, this flagrant flag waving stuff seemed disrespectful.
It occurs to me when you had said you didn't put any flag waving into G.I. Joe, you mean metaphorically and literally.
Yeah. But I did do that one scene where Roadblock stops this guy from burning a flag in the embassy, and the guy says, yeah, but why are you kidding at me for? There's all these other guys stealing typewriters and stuff, And Roadblock says, well, nobody ever died for a typewriter, That sort of really hit home for a lot of people.
Shifting gears slightly, a cousin of G.I. Joe is Nth Man, 16-issue Marvel series, cut down before it could reach its full 24-issue run, but Larry did get to tell the whole story just a little shorter. I don't know if you folks noticed this, but the Nth Man, John Doe, just showed up for the first time in print in decades in a Marvel Deadpool comic. Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe yet again, issue number 1, written by Cullen Bunn. Larry, how does it feel that Deadpool, a character you've written, killed a version of John Doe the Nth Man, a character you created?
Well, it's weird. I actually wrote the first encounter between Deadpool and Wolverine.
Right.
And at that time, I didn't really know anything about, Deadpool hadn't been around all that long, But, after you've written one page of Deadpool, you sort of just get into it. You realize, oh, there's no way I can be over the top with this. I like writing Deadpool just as much as I like writing Sabretooth. Because Sabretooth was the same. If there wasn't anything you could do that people would go, oh, that's way over the top. I think that's what makes those characters interesting.
So to circle back, someone else killed a version of, because it's the multiverse, the Nth Man.
Yeah.
How did that make you feel?
I don't care.
I'm just fishing for a good punchline.
Because look, what is death in comic books? When I was an editor at DC, people wanted to kill off characters all the time. Now, how many times did Wonder Woman's boyfriend get killed? Things like that. And all the new fledgling writers always think that, I could sell a lot of books by killing off a popular character. I just never liked that. I figured if I was assigned to a book and I wasn't going to be the permanent, writer or artist on the book, that I was just a caretaker, and it wasn't up to me to kill off creations, And almost all the characters that I created in Marvel were killed off, Rage and, all the others. So I'm used to it.
So Rage was on your Avengers run.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of them got better.
So some of them got better. All right. So this is, we're in June 2025, issue 317 of G.I. Joe. Came out a few weeks ago. Just so we can stick a pin in this moment, Larry, what issue have you most recently plotted or scripted for Skybound?
Number 323.
Cool.
333.
You're more than 10 ahead? No, that's got to be 2.
No, wait a second. 2, 3. Oh no, because 321 is the new silent issue.
Okay.
So I'm at the 324, I think.
All right, so about 6 issues ahead. All right.
Well, they don't want to be, they're smart. They don't want to be caught, having to do another issue 21.
They don't want to crank out an issue in just a couple of days.
Right.
Or compromise quality.
Yeah, and just a reminder for everyone, it's coming out monthly. You're still writing G.I. Joe, it's coming out monthly. It's very good. And 3 trades have been released so
yes,
far.
if you don't want to buy single issues, volume 1, 2, and 3 of this current Skybound Image Comics Larry Hama written G.I. Joe or A Real American Hero are available at your local comic book shop, with covers by Andy Kubert, who drew some covers for G.I. Joe and Special Missions in 89 and 90.
We've got time for a quick Andy Kubert story. Do you want to tell us about meeting Andy Kubert and his first work?
Well, I got a call from Joe Kubert. He said, listen, my kid's coming over to show you his work, and I just want to tell you that I don't want you to go easy on him because he's my kid. I mean, you tell him exactly what he needs to be told. And I got the word from the man himself, Joe Kubert. And so Andy comes in and he shows me his stuff, and I basically I gave him work, but I basically made him redraw like about a third of it. And a lot of people resent that at first. I had one guy, who I did a portfolio review for him when he was just starting out, and I reamed him a new one, and he went away and he said he hated my guts for 10 years. But one day he figured out that everything I had told him was right. That, when he went back and looked at it, he said, yeah, that was what was wrong with the stuff. And I've had guys come in, they show me their stuff, and I tell them, it's not really going to go anywhere. And one guy said, well, I showed the same work to 10 other editors, and they all said I was really terrific. And I said, did any one of those 10 editors give you a job? And they said, no. And I said, well, they were blowing smoke because, they didn't want bad vibes, and they just wanted you to get out of their office, And I said, look, I'm not just telling you what's wrong with the stuff. I'm spending precious time explaining to you what is wrong with the stuff and how to correct it. And if you can't appreciate that, I don't know what to say. Look, I sat next to Neil Adams at his studio for 3 years. I watched him, tear apart everybody, and plus he was tearing me apart. He would tell me exactly what was wrong. Sometimes I was drawing something once, and he was standing behind me eating a cookie and going, I said, what's wrong? He said, I guess you haven't memorized the 16 planes of the nose yet. And then he walks away. And I turned around and said, Neil, what are the 16 planes of the nose? And he came back and he made a diagram and explained it all. Neil did that. He didn't tell you, oh, it sucks. He actually sat down and, guys would show him the portfolio, and he would make tracings and, do the corrections on the pages. And one day this teenage kid named
Frank Miller.
I'm sorry, I just had a senior moment. Frank Miller, this teenager, comes in and shows Neil his stuff, and Neil ripped him a brand new one. And but at the end of it, he said, listen, try to do everything I just told you to fix and come back in 6 months. He came back. 90% of the other people never come back. They just go, he's full of crap, He doesn't know what he's talking about. And, you never heard of them again, right? So Frank comes back, and he kept coming back, and he kept getting ripped a new one. And it got to the point where the guys in the front room, like Carl Potts, said, oh, that Miller kid is here again. I can't stand this. It's too excruciating. I got to go get a cup of coffee. And then one day, Frank comes in and he shows Neil the stuff, and Neil looks at it and looks at it and looks at it, doesn't say a word. Then he picks up the phone and he calls Denny O'Neill at Marvel. He says, Denny, I'm sending this kid over, and if you don't give him work, you're crazy. And that's how Frank got into the business. And Frank never forgot that, you know.
Larry, thank you so much.
Okay.
If you have questions for Larry, if you have things for him to sign, or you want to buy prints, Larry will be at at Carson Metaxas's Operation Recall booth down on the con floor until the end of the show. If you were here but somehow missed this panel, it'll be an episode of Talking Joe very soon. Larry, thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
And Tim has some comics if you want some.
Okay. I gotta
Go back.
Yeah, I gotta go back and get some lunch.